Absolutely delighted to chat to Nic Smith, who's founder at the Flourishing Coach. Nic is a positive psychologist who's had a very successful career in recruitment and who's trained and become a genuine expert in helping businesses develop well-being strategies and solutions that create an impact. For any business leader, you should listen to this. For any leader, you should listen to this. There is a science behind Nic's principles that many, and I'd suggest most well-being experts don't seem to have. And during our chat, we'll touch on, when it comes to well-being, what actually makes a difference in practice, why companies switch off well-being when the SH1T hits the fan, how we can prevent burnout, and the challenges of managing remotely. We all need to know this stuff and develop our understanding both for us and for our teams. Enjoy. A massive welcome to the TRM podcast to Nic Smith. Thank you for joining us, Nic.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Good. Well, listen, we're going to be talking about all things well-being, but just to kind of put you into context, do you want to tell the story from the what brought you here? Because you started out as a recruiter.
I absolutely did. Yes. When I graduated, I did my undergrad in psychology. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Headed into the West End and registered with a recruitment company, and ended up working there for 12 years, as you do. So yeah, very much went on the journey from being a graduate trainee to then moving forward towards director level in that time. So individual contributor and also a manager and director.
Love it. And you're on that journey, you obviously, when you started educating yourself in psychology, and then many years later, you did your master's in positive psychology, I think it is. What on that journey as entry-level recruiter through to being a senior leader in a sizable recruitment business, was that just was that nurtured your interest in psychology and performance, and how did that develop?
Well, that's an excellent question. So I think that I definitely wanted to do a job when I graduated that involved people, and also money, and so at the time recruitment felt like a really sensible option. And I think that I definitely applied a lot of the learnings from my undergrad degree to my work, but I would say that probably came to the fore much more so when I was managing and leading. And perhaps a little less so from an individual contributor perspective, probably more sort of self-control and self-awareness in that respect. And the leadership side of things has really then led me through to where I am today. So I started my own business about seven and a half years ago, focusing mainly on leadership development and coaching. During COVID, as did many, received a bit of a hit just because nobody was really doing any training that wasn't face-to-face. And that's when I then applied for my master's. And so I did that, started it during lockdown and graduated earlier this year.
Love it. And so positive psychology, for us lay people, what does that mean?
Yeah, good question. So psychology at large tends to deal with things that we would probably refer to as more deficit-based. So mental illness, people who are struggling with a variety of different disorders, of which now there are thousands classified in the sector. So what positive psychology and how it came about was in 2000, the head of the American Psychological Association, a guy called Martin Seligman, really sort of launched positive psychology as it was then. And he spoke about focusing on what makes us well rather than how do we get better when we're not well. And so positive psychology is really the focus on what's strong and how we create optimal human functioning, as opposed to fixing problems that already exist. Although you could argue that probably it does a bit of that along the way anyway.
Yeah, so continuous development to make us as well as we can be will put us in good stead for tougher times.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was speaking to an occupational health practitioner the other day who does a lot of gets a lot of inbound around mental health challenges in a fairly big corporation, nothing to do with recruitment, and she was just saying there's a lack of coping mechanisms that we're equipped with these days to deal with some of the things we have to face. Is that when you were, up until 2015, when you were working in recruitment, was well-being on the agenda, or was it evolving? Where did it feature then, like 8 years ago?
Yeah, I've been pondering this actually, and I've got to say, so the organisation I work for, Aspire, it's really interesting because I remember way back then when really well-being certainly didn't have the buzz around it as it does now. It was very much an emerging concept in organizations. We actually had well-being Wednesdays. So our directors and our the owners of the organization actually really promoted it from the outset, in terms of, very early adopters of flexible working, obviously very different to what it is now, but certainly there was elements of that, really honing in on what people wanted and what would benefit people, as opposed to just what they thought might be best. Even to things like, I remember we had a yoga teacher that would come on site for those people who wanted to do it once a week. A bunch of us would go after work, nutrition and education around that. So it's interesting looking back. There were definitely organizations even back then that were doing it, and I felt very fortunate, and I do still feel very fortunate that I worked for an organization that really embraced that.
Yeah. So fast forward today, then obviously we had COVID. We all sort of started doing whatever we could as business leaders to look after our teams.
Yeah.
Some of us really well, some of us less well. Best practice today, what does it look like for you?
I think it's a really tricky one because, and I know you and I have discussed it a little bit around what does doing well-being in the workplace actually mean? And I think fundamentally my belief is there is a big difference between doing it because it's what everyone is doing and it's what we're supposed to be doing, and doing it because it really is the right and most productive thing to do. So for me, that's the starting point, is actually working out, if we're going to talk about well-being in an organization, what's prompted that conversation. And what's really interesting is, more often than not, it will be because of some kind of deficit. So when someone gets in contact with me, it's because they've had a bunch of people leaving, productivity or performance isn't there, they're perhaps not able to hire and compete with companies who are looking after employee well-being. It could be attrition, it could be the results of a poor engagement survey. There's usually some kind of what I would call probably negative trigger to prompt looking at workplace well-being. And so at that point, you're almost already uphill. So it's almost reversing that and thinking, actually, if we take care of people all the time and not just when the chips are down, or we've had the results of some kind of poor report, be it engagement or performance, then actually you're going to maintain that level of optimal performance, rather than that very much up and down that quite often we can see, particularly in the recruitment sector.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So I've I think I've probably onboarded 400 members into the recruitment network over the last few years. The conversation starts out, right, okay, fantastic, look forward to working with you. Where do you want to take this business? What does it look like down the line? Aspirationally, obviously, people will look from a shareholder point of view, saying, I'd love to create this shareholder value. I'd love to build the organization to this sort of size. When it comes to the type of employer you want to be and what you want it to look like and feel like as an organization down the line, I can't think, and I was thinking as you were talking, I can't think of an organization that has quite articulated their aspiration to look after their people, possibly the way that you would say maybe that would be a good idea. And that almost confirms to me that we're still learning a hell of a lot. If you want to be the ultimate organization, the ultimate employer who really genuinely looks after the well-being and wellness of their people, then you need to aspire to that, you need to articulate that, and then you need to start to work towards it. But most of us maybe don't quite know exactly what that means.
I think well-being as a term is really fluffy. Positive psychology as a term is a pretty big turn-off, I think, for a lot of people, just because of the language that's used. What's really interesting is quite often when I go in with an initial proposal to almost sell the caring of well-being in an organization, I will talk about the impact and the benefits that doing that actually will have on that company. So, for example, and I'm going to talk probably today a little bit about science, purely because my master's was a scientific master's, and all of the work that I do, I try as much as possible for it to be evidence-based. So rather than kind of that slightly more fluffy, I'm trying to add some, dare I say ROI, but certainly some research that actually backs up the things that I'm saying. And we know from all of the research that companies that have high levels of well-being amongst their employees and their leaders are more productive, more profitable, have higher levels of engagement. People report increased happiness, if that is a thing that can be measured. They have lower levels of attrition. They have fewer sick days. So there really is only upside by looking after the well-being. And yet almost we wait for those things to be triggers before we start looking at it. So if I was talking to one of my lecturers at the university, I would probably be frowned upon a little bit for talking in that way. And it's like, no, actually, you start with the person and helping the person be the very best that they can be and caring about the person. And then all of the other stuff is just a byproduct of caring about the employees that work for you. And so it's the balance between that message, but also the message of actually, if you pay attention to these things, it is only going to benefit your culture and your organization financially.
It was funny. I was driving the other day, and I was listening to Steve Hansen, the All Black coach, and really, really competitive, performance obsessed guy. But then when he got when he was got under the skin of what had enabled him to be as successful as he had been, he definitely, he didn't use the word well-being or wellness, but he definitely talked about helping individuals within his team feel good about themselves and be in a good place. And I suppose, I mean, you've done an awful lot of leadership training over the years and coaching of executives. I guess if every one of us who are leaders or managers or get to a place where our people feel good about themselves and feel good in themselves, then it, as you say, the correlation between that and performance, which will give us what we're all aspiring to, is fairly obvious.
Absolutely, because let's remember, particularly if I think about recruitment and I think about what the goal is of the leaders and managers that I work with, it is to create an environment that is conducive to success.
Yeah.
And so actually, if people don't feel good, that isn't a great environment to be successful. So, and I think the thing is because something like well-being can feel a bit fluffy and a bit intangible, what companies then revert to is maybe throwing money at the problem. And what I mean by that, the solution, what I mean by that is fresh fruit, free gym memberships, your perk boxes and things like that, which are great, but they potentially aren't increasing the levels of well-being as much as some of the things that actually you probably wouldn't even think of in an organization. So there has to be some education around actually what makes a difference.
If you're you work with organizations, multiple sectors, about developing and implementing their workplace well-being, and like most successful change, I guess it starts at the top. Are most people approaching you, as you said, because actually we've got something that's not quite as good as it could be, or the aspirational business leader who says, I want to be the ultimate leader at employing the best team and the happiest team? Or do you quite often find yourself sat around the top table having to persuade them that this is actually quite a cool thing to do because it will impact ultimately the business performance?
I think it's a real mix, and I'm not seeing either camp. I think there are definitely the leaders, and actually what's quite interesting is quite often if it's fix a problem or just to enhance well-being of the organization because it's what we should be doing. Typically I'm speaking to people, managers, heads of people, VPs, HR. If it's okay, I think that we're at a point now where we want to be more aspirational, and we want to we want to go from doing really well to then sort of that sort of stratospheric performance. There's something very that is a real privilege actually to work with leaders like this, but there's something about the kind of the humility of saying, I think I can be better as a leader for both myself and my people. I don't know where that is at the moment, so yeah, I'm going to go out and I'm going to consult, and I'm going to work on myself as an individual, because yes, you're right, top down of course, but no one wants to admit that they haven't got it right, especially when you're leading the organization and you're expected to know exactly what's going on at all times.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people would say, well, let's check out if I've got a problem in the first place. Do employee engagement studies and surveys, do they ask the right questions about, are we looking after you all right?
Yes, I think they do. I think that it's funny, I've got quite a few clients that have a number of different sort of questionnaires and surveys and things that they send out, and you can unfortunately then receive sort of fatigue from people, and they're filling it out because they've either been told they have to, or they don't fill it out because they can't be bothered to do another one. And actually the last one that we filled out, no one paid any attention, so what's the point? So it's interesting, I hear that quite a lot. So there's no point in having them if you don't do anything with the data. But maybe it's a good point in our conversation now to talk about the almost like the pillars and components of well-being, because engagement is one of 9. So as an organization, if you're measuring engagement and then assuming that that's what tells you whether your workforce has high levels of well-being or not, you're possibly missing a trick, particularly if you're then confounded by the fact that everyone seems really engaged and yet we're not getting a performance. Right? And we see that as well. Yeah.
One of the other things that I always talk about, saying when I think about the primary skills we need as managers in a recruitment business, wherever, is coaching. And there's a significant lack of coaching expertise from what I've seen, or investment in helping our managers to be the ultimate coaches. How much of if I've got a team and I'm working with a team and I need to really get under their skin to understand where they're at, to what extent is that critical when you think of the organizations that you work with that do go on the journey? Have they got to be as good a coaches, not as you, because you do that as your job, but to what extent is that skill set critical to build the ultimate organization from a well-being perspective? Because if you don't know how I'm feeling and you're my line manager, then you maybe not going to be able to help me get to the better place.
Yes, there's so much in that question, because you can actually ask perfect questions, coachy type questions, non-leading questions as a manager. But actually, if you've created an environment where there's no psychological safety and mental health is generally frowned upon, and people don't trust you, you can ask as many good questions as you like. People aren't going to answer honestly. So I think there are a number of different criteria that as a leader and a manager you need to satisfy before you're going to even be able to begin to understand what somebody needs. And it is making it okay for people to speak freely without being judged. I mean, that's one of the sort of tenets of coaching. But I think it's really important, because whilst my space is workplace wellbeing, I'm really passionate about it, and I'm really passionate about working with organizations. Make no mistake, this isn't about saying to a company, your workforce have low levels of well-being and that is your fault and your responsibility to increase it. There has to be some ownership also by the individuals. And it can't be a leader saying, I've noticed, you don't get much physical exercise, or, I've noticed that, you haven't really got many meaningful relationships in your life. You should probably think about getting some of those. clearly that's not going to work.
Yeah.
But also as an individual, I need to get to that point myself, because you telling me something that I'm probably already aware of, it then renders it a pointless conversation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So help me understand, if you went into an organization that was doing this really well, what would you be seeing? What would they be doing?
Okay, so they would be, well, first of all, from a non-well-being perspective, they'd be doing really well.
Yeah.
And so therefore I probably wouldn't even get a foot in the door. So that would be the first thing. Although I have to say, in any well-being is one of those things where you never complete the level, and I talk about this a lot. There are these different pillars and different pots of well-being that we all have to constantly be feeding. And it's having that awareness where, you know, if I'm not feeling great, then I've probably taken my eye off one of them. So we've always got to be continually investing, but I would be seeing really high quality connections between colleagues, but between leadership and their team members. I'd be seeing a workforce who felt that not only that they mattered, but also that the work they did matters. I'd be seeing people who have some purpose, and I'd see people working towards goals, right? So this is interesting. So I can't remember, unfortunately, and I should really give them a nod, but I can't remember who I heard say it recently. But you know, hard work is good for you, right? It really, it genuinely is. And so, and actually one of the pillars of well-being is accomplishment, right? And actually, if you have high levels of accomplishment, then chances are, you know, you're going in the right direction in terms of your personal well-being, and the same within an organization. So one of the things that I talk about is that very basic Sir John Whitmore grow model with managers. So when you're having a one-to-one, you know, when you're doing an appraisal, or when you're talking about, right, what do you want to achieve in 2024, that you're using some of those techniques, so people can get to a sense of accomplishment, and that's accomplishment on their own terms, rather than necessarily what the company thinks they could be doing more or less, or whatever. So those things have to go kind of hand in hand.
It's interesting to talk about accomplishments. There used to be an exercise I did when I got people to talk about the time in their career when they absolutely smashed it out of the park on a consistent, sustained basis. And every time you said, describe what was happening, one of the things that came out was I felt valued, and I felt I was adding value, which goes a little bit back to the accomplishment that you're talking about. So and again, you've studied the psychology of it, this work, whereas I'm just guessing at some things have just not changed too much. That has just been a truth for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So what has fundamentally changed in the last 10 years that requires us to get better? Is it because we're more open? Is it because we're more conscious of mental well-being? What fundamentally has changed?
I think there are a few things. I think, first of all, people are much more in tune, and certainly some of the graduates and younger people coming into organizations now are much more in tune with the kind of place they want to work, but more importantly, how they want that to make them feel. I don't think that people feel a pressure to prove themselves necessarily, and actually it's much easier to blame the environment than it is to take responsibility myself. So I think more than ever, it's important that employers not only are seen to be getting that right, but are getting that right, so that people understand you can't create accomplishment if someone doesn't feel like they've got the pathways and agency to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that if you look at any of the stats out there, so your Gallups, your Mental Health Foundation stats, all of them are saying over half the workforce don't feel like workplace well-being is particularly great for them at the moment. We're seeing around only 24, so only a quarter of the workforce would answer and strongly agree that their employer actually cares about their well-being, even though they probably say they do and they invest in it, they genuinely don't feel like people care. We're seeing record levels of burnout. We're seeing all of these buzz phrases around quiet quitting, great resignation. We're seeing, obviously, the difficulty, not just in work life. If I think about when I started recruitment in sort of the early mid 2000s, something like that, it was challenging, and there were some quite big moments that had an impact, but really in the grand scheme of things, nothing compared to what people are up against today, particularly right now. And so actually, if I go back to what I said earlier around, okay, so we want our business to be successful, therefore we have to create an environment that will promote people being successful. I would argue that now more than ever, particularly in the last decade, with all of the research to back it up, it means you have to start looking at workplace well-being. It's got to be on the agenda, and not just that kind of, let's post on LinkedIn that we've sent everyone a Fortnum and Mason. That chance would be a fine thing, but a hamper or whatever. But actually, but it's meaningful, and there's some thought behind it.
Yeah. This year has been really interesting, I think. During the, we've got a community, the recruitment network. We share what we all do. We benchmark each other. We compare notes. During COVID, it was fantastic to see the way so many of our members started looking after their employees in the best way possible. And I think empathetic leadership grew significantly. What is it I can do for you? How are you doing, etc. Last year was for a lot of people, there was smashing records out of the park. The job flow was really good, and then this year's been tough for an awful lot of people, and it's meant that these sort of energy and buy-in and resilience has been knocked in quite significantly for a lot of organizations and a lot of business leaders who've just been struggling to keep their machine going and their business going because the jobs weren't coming in and it was a tougher market and heads were dropping a little bit. What do you see for typically, or maybe too much of, when leaders go through good times and then shift into tougher times? And does well-being suffer and go out the window a little bit?
Yeah, look, let's not beat around the bush. When the shit hits the fan, well-being is one of the first things to go. So it's interesting that quite often when people need it the most, it probably is there the least. And look, I can speak from experience as an external consultant going in. If I track the work that I've done in those peaks and troughs, and on the basis that I absolutely do have clients that work within the sector, so I know what's going on in it. I think that it's and of course there has to be a tightening of purse strings. But what's quite interesting is, if you're doing well-being authentically and well, and you're actually doing the things that really matter, they actually don't cost you. So the danger is if it's a trip to the Caribbean and it's drinks every Friday, or it's an extra day off, or leaving early or whatever, and we're saying actually we're not doing well at the moment, so that's all off the table. Of course it is, because that costs the organization money, and that's where I think it's challenging, and that's why the education piece and the work that I'm trying to do is to really explain to people actually how you can have interventions that are evidence-based, that increase some of these things that you're trying to be better in, that actually don't cost money at all. They cost a bit of effort, they cost a bit of time, and they might need you to admit that perhaps you could be doing a little bit better, or be doing things a little bit differently, and that can be really hard, harder than turning off a tap of money. Those things, they don't cost anything, and sometimes they make a much bigger difference. And if you already know it, it's easier to implement those things. But if you don't, and all you're doing is creating what I would call hedonic, but is usually kind of more monetary and material well-being initiatives, when the finances aren't right, of course you're going to turn the tap off those things. And if people associate your care and their well-being with those things, then actually what message are you delivering?
How do you I guess if you get that internally within the organization, if you get that peer-to-peer support as well from colleagues as well as from leaders, from a sense of belonging and support and safe environment, that's quite powerful. But that needs a lot of does that need a lot of work to achieve that? I was just thinking that, I lost my dad a month ago and it absolutely ripped my world apart. But everyone in the business, my business partner, everybody was just amazing, and I just felt, right, I've got this partly because I've got an amazing team who are going to be supportive. But to create that environment where we all look after each other, is that part of the agenda that you kind of nurture and encourage?
Yeah, sorry to hear about your father's passing. Yeah, I absolutely think so. And again, if I think again back to the pillars of well-being and what makes us, function well and be able to cope with those adversities that life throws at us, meaningful relationships, and in the workplace as much as outside. So relationships that mean something and meaningful conversations around those. And feeling like I matter. So actually, if something's going on, actually not just being asked about it, but also somebody knowing and providing that empathy. And also your physical health, your high quality connections, like all of those things are so important. But just to your point, your colleagues know you, and they know what you need, and I've now worked with a few people in your organization, and I've seen it in real time, that kind of that care that's over and above what we should be doing, but actually we feel that it's right. And that sense of belonging, yes, it's sometimes hard. It's hard to build it if it doesn't exist. And if anything, people feel the opposite. I don't know what the opposite of a sense of belonging is, but, but it starts with wanting to be better, and wanting to provide better for your employees so that they can be better. And if that's your initial thought, then you can do anything, right? You can build a sense of belonging. It's just, it's how you go about it. It's not one day a year pulling everyone out of the business and, just doing an away day. Although they are brilliant and they're great, and you do it the right way, they're worth their weight in gold. That alone isn't going to make everyone feel a sense of belonging.
Should therefore we, as we're employing people into our businesses, should we then align our selection processes to ensure we're bringing in people into the businesses that genuinely care about others and have support as one of their values, in order to make sure we've got a tribe of people who are there for each other? Just thinking on the hoof here. Because,
I like it. Number one, I'd be really intrigued at how one would measure it. I suppose you could do some scenario-based interviewing around it. But I think that not everyone sees the value in quality connections and relationships because perhaps they haven't experienced them. So actually, alongside this, particularly for organizations that have more experienced members of staff who, have lived a little through maybe adversities, of any age, right? That's not an age thing, that's just an experience thing. But, I think over the years, and still today, I talk to people and I learn something. So actually, I think it's more about people being open-minded and really interested in me being the best that I can be, so that my manager can be the best that they can be, so that the organization can also be the best that it can be. And as long as those three things are aligned, then you can work with people, because sometimes people don't understand the need for support. If you look at it now, people working fully remote. You know, that I get spoken to a lot about clients who are like, people are really reluctant to come into the office and be face to face, and it's really important that they're face to face because they need to have it. And again, it's unpicking that and understanding, you know, for some people they genuinely don't need it, but for other people perhaps they don't even see the importance of it. So actually our job is to really to work with that and be curious around it and compassionate to whatever it is that we're being presented with, so that we can work towards something that's better.
Do you have are there certain organizations that maybe that we know that do this particularly well? So when you look at true best practice or world-class well-being programs and strategies, are there particular businesses that you think do this particularly well?
Yeah, I think there are loads, and I think that it's evidenced by you know, things like you know, the stuff that people put out on LinkedIn. It depends, you can read as much or as little into that as you want, but when you talk to people that have worked for sort of certain organizations, you know, if you think about the big ones that you know, it's your usual kind of, you know, your Googles and your Facebooks, and you know, they are absolutely connected to you know, trying to create that optimal environment for human functioning whilst making a profit. You know, so that's always going to play into it. But there are absolutely companies who are doing that really well, and doing certain elements of it. You know, I often I'll talk about how you can you know, increase well-being in the organization through really kind of practical measures. And when I show the slides, I always have a best in class, so people can see who's doing it and where those ideas are coming from and where it's working really well in practice.
Yeah, Nick, I'd absolutely love this. And actually I really like, I don't know whether I should say this or say it, but the fact that what you've done has been underpinned by the science, because I do think that matters. I think I've tried a few things over the years where I wasn't possibly totally qualified to do it, and I do know that if you study the science, there is it does enable you to have an impact that you might not otherwise, unless you've got that kind of background to it. And I think that's really fascinating. Can I ask, how do, if somebody wanted to work with you, whether it's an individual or a business, what kind of interventions are you having, and how do they get hold of you?
So well, LinkedIn, the website, I'm sure we'll have links, and
yeah,
you know, we'll obviously I'm easily found on there, plus on TRM as well. You can contact me that way. And I think intervention wise, you know, my speciality is I suppose three key areas: leadership, so increasing well-being through working with leaders. I do a lot of coaching and group coaching at a leadership and a manager and exec level. What's really interesting is organizations who do well-being really well tend to role model it from the top down. So quite often, if I'm doing a session and the C-suite aren't in there, and I'm doing you know, something on, you know, mental fitness or something like that, and it's missing the decision makers, that worries me. So I'm like, this is relatively pointless, because actually you need their buy-in, because they need to live and breathe it. So that's another intervention. And then just generally resilience programs, workshops around, you know, people being aware of actually what are these pillars of well-being, and in practice in our organization, how can we implement them? And then I partner with lots of different organizations that can help in specific areas also that I'm perhaps not as specialist in.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. Thank you, Nick. I could carry on talking for a long time, but I'm conscious of your time. But it does feel so relevant, you know, right here. I speak to 50 recruitment business leaders every week. A lot of them are challenged by by how to get the balance right between leading a successful organization, but also bringing their people with them and looking after them in the right way. You know, balancing empathy and performance is really interesting. But what I've taken away is actually, if you can create that ongoing environment where it's part of the machine, and people are both trained and aware of what they can and should be doing, and the management have got the skills, then actually it can go on irrespective of good market, bad market, Absolutely love it. Well, listen, we will keep on talking, Nic. Thank you so much for coming along and sharing your expertise and your thoughts and experience. Anybody listening, please reach out to Nic. Details will be on the back of this podcast. Nic, it's been brilliant. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Don't forget to follow the TRM podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts for a new exciting episode every week.